I don't even know if I'll live through tomorrow. But you're still walking. What else is there to do? He glanced at her then, something like approval flickering across his features. You're tougher than you look, Clara Whitlock. I've had practice at being tougher than I look. They walked in silence for another hour, the sun climbing higher and turning the desert into a furnace. Clara's wrapped feet began to throb in earnest, and she could feel sweat soaking through her clothing despite the dry air. But she kept moving, matching Kael's pace as best she could, refusing to be the one who asked to stop. Finally, Kael raised his hand and they halted. They'd reached another canyon, deeper and more sheltered than the one they'd slept in, with rock walls that provided blessed shade. Without a word, Kael led her to the shade and gestured for her to sit. Rest here. We'll wait out the worst of the heat, then continue when the sun starts to drop. Clara collapsed onto the ground, her legs shaking. Kael handed her one of the water containers and she drank gratefully, trying not to think about how much they had left or how far they still had to go. How many days? She asked. Until we reach wherever you're taking me? 2 more if we keep this pace, 3 if your feet give out. They won't. She said it with more confidence than she felt. We'll see. He settled against the canyon wall, positioning himself where he could watch both her and the entrance. Tell me something, Clara. When I reached for you last night, you could have screamed, could have fought. Your people might have heard you, might have tried to help. Why didn't you? Clara considered the question carefully. Because I looked at your eyes and I didn't see cruelty. I saw calculation, decision. Clara latched onto the words. You keep saying that. Who are your people? The ones who will decide whether you live or die when we arrive. He said it calmly, as if discussing the weather. I can protect you to a point, but ultimately they'll make their own judgments about what to do with a white woman I pulled from a raid. And what do you think they'll decide? That depends entirely on you. He closed his eyes, seemingly settling in for a rest despite his claim that he'd keep watch. Get some sleep, Clara. We move again in 3 hours. Clara lay back against the hard stone, her mind racing despite her exhaustion. She was 2 days away from a settlement of people who might kill her. She was being guided there by a man whose motivations remained mysterious at best. She had no weapons, no leverage, no plan beyond surviving the next few hours. And yet, impossibly, she felt more alive than she had in the entire year since her husband's death. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, it felt like waking up. The settlement revealed itself gradually, like a secret the desert had been keeping. Clara had been watching the landscape transform over the past 2 days, the harsh, open terrain giving way to something more varied, more alive. Now, as they crested a final ridge in the copper light of late afternoon, she saw it spread below them in a hidden canyon that seemed to exist outside the world she'd known. It wasn't what she'd expected, not a collection of crude shelters or temporary camps, but something more permanent, more intentional. Adobe structures built into the canyon walls themselves, blending so seamlessly with the rock that she might have missed them entirely if not for the smoke rising from cooking fires and the movement of people between buildings. There, Kael said, the first word he'd spoken in hours. My home. Clara's throat had gone dry, and not just from thirst. How many people? Enough to make this complicated. He started down the ridge, moving with the same confident stride that had carried them through 2 days of punishing desert travel. Remember what I told you. Don't speak unless spoken to directly. Keep your eyes down but not subservient. There's a difference. And whatever happens, don't show fear. I'm terrified. I know, don't show it. They descended into the canyon, and Clara became aware of eyes tracking their progress. People emerged from the adobe structures. Men, women, children, all of them stopping their activities to watch the strange procession of Kael returning with a white woman in tow. The silence was absolute and oppressive, broken only by the sound of their footsteps and the distant cry of a hawk circling above. A woman stepped into their path. She was perhaps 40, her face lined by sun and experience, her dark eyes sharp with intelligence, and something else Clara couldn't immediately identify. She spoke to Kael in that language Clara had heard during the raid, her tone carrying layers of meaning that transcended the barrier of incomprehension. Kael responded, his voice steady and firm. The exchange grew heated, the woman's gestures becoming more emphatic, her words faster and sharper. Other people began to gather, forming a loose circle around them, their faces revealing varying degrees of curiosity, suspicion, and outright hostility. "She says you should not be here," a new voice said in accented English. Clara turned to find a young man, perhaps 18 or 19, standing at the edge of the circle. He had the same sharp features as Kael, the same dark eyes, though his held more openness, more curiosity than threat. "This is Taran," Kael said. "He'll translate when necessary, though I prefer you learn our language quickly. It will make things easier." "Easier for whom?" the older woman demanded, switching to English with a fluency that surprised Clara. "You bring her here, to our home, and expect what? That we will welcome an outsider? That we will forget what her people have done?" "Mira," Kael started, but the woman cut him off with a sharp gesture. "No. You do not get to decide this alone, Kael Riven. You are our best scout, our finest warrior, but you are not our chief. This requires counsel." She turned her fierce gaze on Clara. "You. What is your name?" "Clara Whitlock." Clara kept her voice level despite the tremor she felt in her chest. "And why should I not kill you where you stand, Clara Whitlock? Your people slaughter ours. They take our land, poison our water, murder our children. Give me one reason why you deserve breath in your lungs." The circle had gone deathly quiet. Clara could feel dozens of eyes on her, could sense the violence coiled beneath the surface of this moment, ready to spring free if she gave the wrong answer. "I can't," Clara said finally. Mira's eyebrows rose. "Excuse me? I can't give you a reason. If my people have done those things, and I don't doubt that they have, then you're right. I probably don't deserve mercy. But I also can't be held accountable for atrocities I didn't commit, any more than you'd want to be judged for actions taken by people who happen to share your skin color." Clara met Mira's eyes directly. "I'm not asking for welcome. I'm not asking for trust. I'm just asking not to die for crimes I didn't commit." The silence stretched so long that Clara thought she might shatter from the tension. Then Mira did something unexpected. She smiled. It wasn't a warm smile, but it held a grudging respect. "At least she has spine," Mira said, switching back to her own language and addressing Kael. Taran translated in a whisper. "She says most white people would be crying or begging or trying to explain why they're different. She appreciates that you're honest." "That doesn't mean I'm letting her stay," Mira continued in English. "Council meets at sundown. Until then, she's your responsibility, Kael. Keep her in your dwelling, and if she causes problems, you'll answer for them." She swept away, the crowd parting for her, and gradually the other onlookers dispersed, though Clara could feel their sideways glances and murmured conversations following her like a physical weight. "Come on," Kael said, touching her elbow lightly. "Let's get you somewhere you can rest before they decide your fate." He led her through the settlement, and despite her exhaustion and fear, Clara found herself cataloging details with the analytical part of her mind that had served her well as a teacher. The settlement was more sophisticated than she'd imagined. Irrigation channels carved into the rock to bring water from somewhere higher in the canyon, communal areas for food preparation and tool-making, spaces that seemed designed for gathering and ceremony. Children played with toys she recognized, dolls, balls made of wrapped leather, while also engaging in activities that seemed purposeful, learning tasks from older siblings or parents. It was a community, a real functioning community with structure and purpose in life. "You're surprised," Kael observed. "I was told your people lived like animals, that you were savages who couldn't build or plan or create anything meaningful. And what do you think now?" "I think the people who told me that were either liars or fools." Clara stepped carefully over an irrigation channel. "Or both." Kael's dwelling was built into the canyon wall itself, a single room with an opening that let in light and air, furnished simply but thoughtfully. Woven mats on the floor, a sleeping platform built into the rock, storage areas carved directly into the stone. Everything had a place. Everything served a purpose. "Sit," Kael instructed, gesturing to one of the mats. "I'll bring water and food. Don't leave this space until I return. Understand? There are people here who won't be as patient as Mira." "Mira seemed ready to kill me." "Exactly. Imagine how the impatient ones feel." He paused at the entrance. "Clara, you did well out there. Better than I expected." Then he was gone, leaving her alone in his home with nothing but her thoughts and the distant sounds of the settlement conducting its daily business. Clara unwrapped her feet carefully, examining the damage. The blisters had improved somewhat with Kael's treatment, though new ones had formed during their journey. She needed to clean them again, needed to rest, needed to process everything that had happened in the past 2 days. Instead, she found herself standing and moving to the entrance, looking out at the settlement that might become her execution ground by sunset. You should listen to him. Clara spun to find a girl, maybe 14 or 15, standing in the entrance, holding a clay vessel of water and a basket of what looked like bread. She had the same dark hair and eyes as most of the people Clara had seen, but her face held more openness, more curiosity than suspicion. "I'm Sarah," the girl said in careful English. "Kael asked me to bring these to you while he speaks with the elders." "Thank you." Clara took the offerings, suddenly aware of how hungry she was. "Your English is very good. I learned from traders, and from—" Sarah hesitated, something crossing her face that looked like old pain. "I had a friend once, from your world. She taught me many words." "Had?" "She died. Soldiers came and there was sickness, and she died." Sarah said it matter-of-factly, but Clara could hear the grief beneath the words. "That's why some people here hate you, not because of you exactly, but because you remind them of loss." Clara sat down heavily on the mat, the weight of that statement pressing on her. "I'm sorry. For your friend, and for all the losses." "Are you?" Sarah tilted her head, studying Clara with an intensity that reminded her of Kael. "Or are you just saying words that might keep you alive?" "Both, probably. But the sorry part is real." Clara broke off a piece of the bread. It was dense and slightly sweet, made with something other than wheat. "Can I ask you something? Why did Kael bring me here? He could have left me in the desert or with my people. Why risk bringing me to your home?" Sarah settled onto the floor across from Clara, crossing her legs beneath her. "Because Kael sees things others don't. Patterns, connections. It's what makes him our best scout. He sees 3 steps ahead while others are still figuring out step 1. That doesn't answer my question. Doesn't it?" Sarah smiled, and it transformed her serious face into something lighter, younger. "He saw something in you, something useful or interesting or worth the risk of angering Mira and the council. What that is—" She shrugged. "Maybe you'll figure it out before they decide to kill you. Maybe you won't. You're very casual about discussing my potential execution. Death is part of life here. We don't pretend otherwise." Sarah stood, brushing off her clothing. "I have to go. I'm supposed to be helping with meal preparation. But Clara, learn quickly. Not just the language, but the ways, the rhythms, how we move and work and exist. If you're going to survive the council, you'll need to prove you can be more than just a burden." She left before Clara could respond, slipping out of the dwelling as silently as she'd appeared. Clara ate the bread and drank the water, her mind churning through everything she'd learned. Outside, the settlement continued its daily rhythms. She could hear voices calling to each other, the sound of tools striking stone, laughter from children playing some game she couldn't see. Normal sounds, human sounds, the sounds of life continuing regardless of her presence or peril. When Kael returned, the light had shifted toward evening, painting the canyon walls in shades of red and gold. "The council is gathering," he said without preamble. "You'll stand before them and answer their questions. Be honest. They'll know if you lie. Be respectful, but not subservient." "And Clara?" He met her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Tell them what you told me about Boston, about being abandoned by your own people. They understand betrayal. They understand being cast out. Use that. You're coaching me. I'm giving you a chance. What you do with it is up to you." The council met in a circular space carved into the canyon wall, open to the sky above. 7 elders sat in a semicircle, 4 men and 3 women, all of them bearing the marks of age and wisdom and hard-earned authority. Mira was among them, her face impassive as Kael led Clara to the center of the circle. The entire settlement had gathered to watch. Clara could feel their presence at her back, could sense their collective judgment pressing down on her like a physical weight. An older man, perhaps the oldest person Clara had ever seen, his face a map of wrinkles and his eyes sharp as obsidian, spoke first. Taryn, positioned at the edge of the circle, translated in a low voice. "He is Chief Navin. He asks why you have come to their lands." "I didn't choose to come here," Clara said, pitching her voice to carry. "Kyle brought me after the raid on my wagon train. I was traveling to California, trying to start a new life after losing everything in Boston." More questions, rapid fire, translated by Taryn. Where was she from? What did she know of their people? Had she participated in violence against them? Did she carry weapons or knowledge that could harm them? Clara answered each question honestly, aware that her life hung on every word. She explained her husband's death, the debts, the social exile that had driven her west. She admitted her ignorance about the tribes and peoples of this region, acknowledged that she'd been taught things that were clearly lies or distortions. She showed them her empty hands, her blistered feet, the evidence of her vulnerability. "You speak of loss," Mira said, her English cutting through the translated questions. "But what do you know of true loss? Of having your children stolen in the night? Of watching your homes burned while soldiers laugh? Of drinking from poisoned streams because all the clean water has been claimed by people who look like you?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Clara could feel the anger beneath it, the accumulated grief of generations. "Nothing," Clara said quietly. "I know nothing of those losses. My losses are small and personal, and probably meaningless compared to what you've endured. But they're mine, and they're real to me. And they're the reason I'm here instead of dead in Boston or in that wagon circle." She paused, gathering her courage. "I can't undo what's been done to your people. I can't make those crimes right. But I also can't become someone different than who I am. I'm a teacher who knows mathematics and literature and useless social graces. If there's a way for that to be valuable here, then I'll prove my worth. If not, then—" She met Mira's eyes directly. "Then do what you must. But at least give me the chance to be more than just another white face you kill out of justified rage." The silence that followed was absolute. Clara could hear her own heartbeat, could feel sweat trickling down her spine despite the evening cool. Chief Navin spoke, his voice quiet, but carrying absolute authority. Taryn translated, "He says you have courage to speak plainly, that many would hide behind pretty words or tears. He asks what you would teach, if they permitted you to live." "Anything I can," Clara said immediately. "Reading, writing, mathematics, English, if that would be useful for trading with others. History, though I suspect your version is more accurate than what I learned. I could help with record keeping, with any written communication you might need. I learn quickly. I could learn your language, your ways, become useful in ways I haven't even thought of yet." More consultation among the elders, rapid conversation in their language that Taryn didn't bother translating. Clara stood in the center of the circle, aware that she was on trial not just for her own actions, but for the accumulated sins of everyone who shared her skin color. Finally, Mira stood. The crowd quieted instantly. "We have decided," she said in English. "You may live, for now. You will remain in Kyle's dwelling under his responsibility and supervision. You will begin learning our language immediately. You will help where you can and stay out of the way when you cannot help." "And Clara Whitlock?" Her eyes bore into Clara with unforgiving intensity. "If you betray us, if you bring danger to our people, if you prove to be more trouble than worth, we will not hesitate to remove the problem. Do you understand?" "I understand." "Then welcome to our settlement. May you prove worthy of the mercy we've shown you." The council dispersed and the crowd began to break apart, people returning to their evening meals and activities. Clara stood frozen in the center of the circle, only now allowing herself to feel the full weight of relief and terror that had been building throughout the interrogation. Cale appeared at her elbow. "Come on. You need food and rest. Tomorrow your real education begins." They walked back to his dwelling in silence, Clara's legs shaking from more than just exhaustion. When they reached the entrance, she finally found her voice. "Thank you for speaking for me, for bringing me here instead of leaving me to die." Cale looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Don't thank me yet. The hard part is just beginning. Being allowed to live and being allowed to belong are very different things." "I know. Do you?" He gestured for her to enter the dwelling ahead of him. Because from here, the only direction is forward. You can't go back to your world. The wagon train is long gone, probably spreading stories about the savage raid and the poor woman taken by hostile forces. Even if you could find your way back to civilization, what would you tell them? That you've been living among the very people they call animals? That you've eaten their food and learned their language and found them to be, what? Human? Clara sank onto the mat, the reality of her situation crystallizing with painful clarity. I'm trapped here. Not trapped. Transformed. There's a difference. Cale settled against the wall, his eyes reflecting the last light of evening. The question is whether you'll fight that transformation or embrace it. Over the following days, Clara discovered what Cale meant. Sarah became her constant companion and primary teacher, drilling her relentlessly in the language and customs of the settlement. The language was complex, with subtle tonal variations that changed meaning entirely, but Clara threw herself into learning with the desperate focus of someone who understood that communication meant survival. She helped where she could, hauling water from the spring, grinding grain, helping to prepare meals under the watchful supervision of women who made their distrust abundantly clear. Some ignored her entirely. Others made small gestures of acceptance, a nod, a brief word of instruction, once even a smile when Clara successfully navigated a particularly tricky phrase. Kael was a constant presence, though not always visible. She would see him at the edges of activities, watching her progress with those dark, assessing eyes. Sometimes he would correct her pronunciation or show her a more efficient way to complete a task. Other times he would simply observe in silence, and Clara found those moments more unnerving than any direct interaction. "You're doing better than expected," Sarah said one afternoon as they sat in the shade, working on a particularly difficult grammatical construction. "Most outsiders can't hear the tonal differences at all, but you're getting it." "I had to learn French and Latin to teach," Clara explained. "It gave me some framework for understanding how languages can work differently than English." "You taught children?" "Young women, daughters of wealthy families who needed enough education to seem cultured, but not so much that they'd threaten their future husbands' egos." Clara couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. "I tried to give them more, tried to teach them mathematics that might actually be useful, history that included perspectives beyond conquest narratives. But the parents complained, said I was putting inappropriate ideas in their daughters' heads." Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then, "You could teach here, really teach. The children need to learn English for trading, but they also need to understand numbers and planning and—" She gestured vaguely. "Everything. Would you want that?" "Yes." The answer came without hesitation. "Yes, I would want that very much." "Then talk to Mira. She oversees the children's education. If you can convince her you're serious, she might let you help." The conversation with Mira happened 2 days later, in the same circular space where Clara had stood trial. But this time it was just the two of them, sitting across from each other as the sun climbed toward noon. "Sarah says you want to teach," Mira said without preamble. "I do. It's what I'm good at, what I was trained for. Our children don't need to learn your society's version of proper behavior or feminine accomplishments. That's not what I teach. Or at least it's not what I want to teach." Clara leaned forward, trying to find the words that would bridge the vast gap between them. "I teach thinking, analysis, how to look at a problem and break it down into solvable pieces. Mathematics isn't just numbers, it's patterns and logic. History isn't just dates and battles, it's understanding how decisions ripple forward through time." Mira studied her with those fierce, intelligent eyes. "And why should I trust you with our children's minds?" "Because I have nothing else to offer. I can haul water and grind grain, but a dozen people can do those things better than me. Teaching is the only skill I have that might actually be valuable here." Clara paused. "And because I think you already know that isolating your children from outside knowledge won't protect them. The world is changing whether any of us like it or not. Giving them tools to navigate that change seems wiser than pretending it isn't happening." A long silence stretched between them. Then Mira smiled, a real smile this time, not the grudging acknowledgement from their first meeting. "You're smarter than you first appeared, Clara Whitlock, or perhaps just desperate enough to be honest." She stood, brushing dust from her clothing. "You may teach. 3 times per week. In the morning when the children have energy.
You'll teach English, mathematics, and whatever else you think they need. But you'll also learn from them, our history, our ways of understanding the world. Education flows both ways. Agreed? Agreed. Teaching the children proved to be both easier and harder than Clara had expected. Easier because they were curious and sharp, and hungry for knowledge in a way her Boston students had never been. Harder because she had to constantly check her assumptions, had to relearn how to explain concepts without relying on cultural references that meant nothing here. "Why do we need to know about multiplication?" a boy named Kai asked during her third session. He was perhaps 10, small for his age, but with eyes that missed nothing. "Because it makes you powerful," Clara replied. "Right now, if a trader comes and says he'll give you 3 blankets for every 5 baskets you weave, how do you know if that's a fair trade?" "We ask an elder." "But what if the elder isn't there? What if you're out hunting or trading alone? If you can calculate in your head that 3 blankets for 5 baskets means you need to make 15 baskets to get 9 blankets, you can make your own decisions. You don't have to rely on anyone else's knowledge. You become powerful in yourself." She saw the moment understanding clicked in his eyes, saw him sit up straighter as he realized what she was offering. Not just numbers, but independence, agency. The children weren't her only students. In the evenings, when the day's work was done, some of the adults would drift to where Clara sat outside Kael's dwelling, ostensibly for other purposes, but clearly positioned to listen as she taught Sarah more advanced mathematics or discussed the principles of written English. Kael himself sometimes listened, though he never participated directly. He would work on repairing tools or preparing leather, his hands busy while his attention tracked every word Clara spoke. "You're good at this," he said one night after the others had drifted away. "At teaching? At making people want to learn. It's a gift." He looked up from the knife he was sharpening. "You're becoming part of things here. Do you feel it?" Clara considered the question carefully. "I feel less like an outsider than I did. But I also feel like I'm walking on ice that could crack at any moment. One wrong word, one mistake, and I'm back to being the enemy." "That's accurate." Kael tested the blade against his thumb. "But the ice gets stronger the longer you walk it, without falling through. Give it time." "How much time?" "However long it takes." He stood, sliding the knife into its sheath. "Come on. There's something I want to show you." He led her out of the settlement as the last light faded, climbing a narrow path up the canyon wall. Clara's feet had healed enough that she could manage the ascent without too much pain, though she was breathing hard by the time they reached a flat outcropping near the canyon's rim. "Look," Kael said simply. The view stole her breath. The settlement spread below them, lights beginning to glow as fires were lit for cooking and warmth. Beyond it, the desert stretched in all directions under a sky that was just beginning to show stars. It was vast and beautiful and terrifying in its indifference to human concerns. "This is what I wanted you to see," Kael said quietly. "Not just the settlement, but everything. The scope of this place. The scale." He gestured toward the horizon. "Your people come here and try to make it into what they left behind. They build houses that don't fit the land, plant crops that require too much water, impose patterns that don't work. And then they wonder why the desert fights back. And your people? We listen to the land. We move with it instead of against it. We've survived here for generations, not because we conquered it, but because we learned to be part of it." He turned to look at her directly. "That's what you need to understand, Clara. If you're going to make this work, if you're going to truly belong here instead of just surviving, you need to stop trying to fit us into your understanding of how the world should work. You need to let the world show you how it actually is." Clara looked out at the vast darkness and felt something shift inside her. Not a sudden revelation, but a gradual recognition of a truth she'd been circling for weeks. "I don't want to go back," she said quietly. "Even if I could, even if it were safe, I don't think I'd want to. Is that strange?" "No." Kael's voice was soft, almost gentle. "It's honest, and honesty is the beginning of everything that matters." They stood in silence as the stars multiplied overhead, and Clara felt the last threads connecting her to her old life begin to fray and break. Whatever came next, whether the settlement fully accepted her or merely tolerated her, whether she found a real place here or remained forever an outsider, she was committed now. The desert had claimed her, and she was done fighting it.
3 months into her new life, Clara woke to find Sarah shaking her shoulder with unusual urgency, her young face pale in the pre-dawn darkness. "You need to come," Sarah whispered. "Now. It's the fever." Clara was on her feet immediately, her mind already cataloging symptoms before she'd fully processed the words. "Who?" "Kai and 2 others, maybe more by now." Sarah's hands were trembling. "They're burning up. We've tried everything, the cooling herbs, the teas Mira makes, but it's not working." "Clara, I've seen this before. When my friend died, it started exactly like this." They ran through the settlement, past dwellings where families were just beginning to stir, toward the healing house built into the deepest part of the canyon where the air stayed coolest. Inside, Mira was moving between 3 small forms laid out on woven mats, her face set in grim concentration as she applied wet cloths to burning foreheads. Kai looked terrible. His skin had taken on a grayish cast, his breathing shallow and rapid. The other 2 children, a girl of perhaps 7 and a boy barely 5, were in similar condition, their small bodies racked with shivers despite the fever that made them hot to the touch. "It's the same as before," Mira said without looking up, her voice tight with controlled fear. "The fever that took half our children 2 summers ago. The one your people's medicine couldn't cure either, before you ask." Clara knelt beside Kai, feeling his forehead with the back of her hand. The heat radiating from him was alarming, but it was his breathing that concerned her more. Too fast, too shallow, as if his body was forgetting how to perform its most basic function. "What treatments have you tried?" Clara asked, slipping automatically into the analytical mode that had served her through countless crises. Mira listed them off. Herbal preparations Clara didn't recognize, cooling techniques, forced hydration. All sensible approaches, but clearly not effective against whatever pathogen was attacking these children. "In Boston," Clara said carefully, "when fever struck like this, the doctors sometimes used willow bark preparations, and there were new medicines coming from Europe, compounds that could break fevers when nothing else worked. But I don't have access to those here, and I don't know if they'd even help with this particular sickness." "Then what good are you?" The words came from a woman Clara recognized as Kai's mother, her face twisted with grief and rage. "You offer us your foreign knowledge, your education, your civilized ways, and now when we need something real, you have nothing?" The accusation hit harder than any physical blow could have. Clara opened her mouth to respond, then closed it, because the woman was right. What good was her mathematics and literature and careful reasoning when faced with this immediate visceral crisis? "There might be something," she heard herself say, the words forming before she'd fully thought them through. "The settlement. The white settlement I was traveling to. They would have medicines. Real medicines from the East, shipped specifically for frontier use. Quinine, laudanum, potentially even some of the newer fever treatments. You want us to raid a settlement for medicine?" Mira's voice was sharp with disbelief. "Even if we could, they'd kill us on sight. And even if we succeeded, how would we know which medicines to take? How would we know how to use them?" "You wouldn't have to raid them." Clara stood, her decision crystallizing with each word. "I would go. I speak their language, I understand their ways. I could trade for medicine, or beg for it, or steal it if necessary, but I could get it without bloodshed." The silence that followed was absolute. Even Kai's labored breathing seemed to pause as everyone in the room processed what Clara had just offered. "You would go back to your people," Mira said slowly, "ask for medicine to save our children, and then return here to us? Why would they give you anything? And more importantly, why would you come back?" "Because these are my people now, too." Clara gestured to Kai, to the other children, to the settlement beyond these walls. "I teach these children. I eat with these families. I sleep under this roof and drink from these springs. If I can save them, I have to try." "Or you could simply leave," Kai's mother said, her voice raw. "Use this as your excuse to escape back to civilization. Tell them whatever lies you need to tell about savage captors, and leave us to bury our children alone." "I could," Clara admitted, "but I won't. Because despite what you think, despite your doubts, this is where I belong now. Not out there. Not with people who share my skin, but nothing else. Here, with you." Kale had arrived during this exchange, standing in the doorway with the stillness that preceded all his movements. It's too dangerous, he said flatly. The settlement will have expanded since the raid. They'll have more guards, more weapons, more paranoia. You'll be walking into a trap. Maybe. But it's the only chance these children have, isn't it? Clara met his eyes directly. You know I'm right. Your medicines aren't working. Neither would mine, if I had any. But they have real pharmaceutical preparations out there, compounds developed specifically for frontier fevers. It's worth the risk. Not your risk to take. It's exactly my risk to take. I'm the only one who can do this without starting a war. The argument continued for hours, involving Chief Navin and the other elders, debates about risk and reward, and whether trusting Clara with this mission was wisdom or foolishness. But in the end, with Kai's breathing growing more labored and 2 more children showing early fever symptoms, they agreed. Clara would ride to the settlement at first light, alone and unarmed, to plead for medicine that might save children whose existence the settlers would celebrate dying. Cale found her that night as she prepared for the journey, checking and rechecking the few supplies she'd been given. I'm coming with you, he said without preamble. You can't. If they see you, they'll shoot first and ask questions never. My only chance is to go alone, look pathetic and desperate, and hope they have enough humanity left to help. They won't help. They'll see you as either a traitor or a victim, and neither version ends well for you. Cale sat down across from her, his face grave in the firelight. Clara, listen to me. I've seen how your people operate. I've watched them for years. They don't see us as human. They see us as problems to be solved, obstacles to be removed. You walking in there asking for medicine to save our children, they're more likely to try to extract information about our location than to actually help. Then I'll lie. I'll tell them I escaped, that I've been wandering, that I don't know where I was held. I'll be whoever I need to be to get those medicines. And if they don't believe you? Clara was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. Then I'll steal what I need and run. But Kael, I have to try. Kai called me by name yesterday, not the white woman or the outsider, but Clara. He trusts me. They're starting to trust me. I can't betray that by doing nothing when I might be able to help. Cale studied her with those dark, unreadable eyes. You've changed, he said finally. The woman I pulled from that wagon circle wouldn't have considered this. She would have seen it as a way out and taken it. That woman died somewhere in the desert between then and now. Clara met his gaze steadily. I'm not her anymore. I don't want to be her anymore. Something shifted in Kael's expression, a softening around his eyes that Clara had never seen before. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and touched her face with a gentleness that seemed impossible from hands that had dealt so much violence. Then come back, he said quietly. Get your medicines, save our children, and come back. Because if you don't, I will tear that settlement apart looking for you. That's not very diplomatic. I'm not a diplomat. I'm a warrior who's made the mistake of caring what happens to a stubborn white woman who doesn't know when to stay safe. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, and Clara felt heat that had nothing to do with the nearby fire. Promise me you'll come back. I promise. She left before dawn, riding a horse the settlement could barely spare, carrying water and directions to the nearest white settlement and nothing else that might suggest where she'd come from. The journey took 2 days of hard riding across terrain that had become familiar to her, past landmarks she now recognized, through a desert that no longer felt quite so hostile. The settlement, when she finally saw it, looked exactly like what she'd expected, a collection of hastily constructed buildings arranged in a defensive grid, surrounded by cleared land meant to provide warning of approaching threats. American flags hung from poles claiming this land in a way that would have seemed righteous to her 3 months ago and now just seemed sad. Clara rode in slowly, hands visible and empty, calling out before she came within rifle range. I'm alone. I'm unarmed. I need help. Men appeared with weapons raised, their faces hard with suspicion. A woman emerged from one of the buildings, her dress marking her as someone with authority, or at least pretensions to it. Who are you? The woman demanded. Where did you come from? My name is Clara Whitlock. I was with a wagon train that was attacked months ago. I've been wandering, trying to find civilization. Please, I need water and food and... Months ago? One of the men lowered his rifle slightly, his weathered face creasing with something like recognition. There was a raid on a wagon train about 3 months back. We heard about it from survivors who made it through. They said everyone else was killed or taken. I escaped, Clara said, hating the lie, but knowing it was necessary. I've been surviving in the desert, hiding, trying to find my way. Is this... She made her voice break convincingly. Is this California? No, ma'am. This is still Arizona territory, Fort Prescott settlement. California is another 2 weeks west if you had proper supplies and protection. The man gestured to his companions to lower their weapons. Come down off that horse. You look half dead. They took her to what passed for a medical facility, a single room with a cot and a shelf of supplies that made Clara's heart leap with hope. The woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Patterson, brought water and bread while a grizzled man who claimed to have medical training looked her over with professional skepticism. You don't look like you've been wandering the desert for 3 months, he said bluntly. Your feet are scarred but healed. Your clothing's worn but not destroyed, and you're not nearly dehydrated or starved enough for that story to hold water. Clara had prepared for this. I found shelter. There was a canyon with spring water and some wild plants I could eat. I've been moving between water sources trying to get my bearings. I'm not proud of how long it took me, but I'm alive. Convenient story. Mrs. Patterson's eyes were sharp. Where's this canyon? Might be others could use that water source. I couldn't find it again if my life depended on it. Everything looks the same out there. Clara shifted tactics, allowing desperation to creep into her voice. Please, I just need some basic supplies and directions to California. I have a little money hidden. I can pay for what I need. The doctor, if he could be called that, started to respond, but Mrs. Patterson cut him off. We'll talk about payment later. First, you'll tell us everything you remember about the raid. The Army's been hunting those savages for months, and any information you can provide might help them finish the job. Clara's blood ran cold, but she kept her face neutral. I don't remember much. It was dark, chaotic. There was gunfire and smoke and screaming. I hid under a wagon, and then I just ran when I had the chance. Did you see their faces, their markings? Any indication of which tribe they belonged to? No. I'm sorry, I was too terrified to notice details like that. Mrs. Patterson's expression suggested she didn't quite believe this, but before she could press further, a commotion outside drew everyone's attention. Clara heard a child crying, not the normal tears of a bruised knee or wounded feelings, but the desperate pained sound of serious illness. That's the third one today, the doctor muttered, moving toward the door. This damn fever is spreading faster than we can treat it. Clara's pulse quickened. Fever? What kind? The killing kind. Comes on fast, burns through children mostly. We've got some quinine and willow bark preparations, but they're not working like they should. Lost 2 yesterday, got 4 more who'll probably follow. He said it with the callous pragmatism of someone who'd seen too much death to waste energy on grief. This was it. The opening Clara needed. I might be able to help, she said carefully. Before my husband died, he worked with doctors in Boston. I learned some nursing techniques, ways to bring down fevers, care protocols. If you're overwhelmed, I could assist. The doctor laughed, a bitter sound. You want to help care for sick children after surviving months in the desert alone? That's either saintly or suspicious, ma'am, and I'm not inclined to believe in saints. Believe what you want. But those children are dying, and I actually know something about fever treatment. Unless your pride is more important than their lives. Mrs. Patterson and the doctor exchanged glances. Finally, the woman nodded. Fine. You can help, but we'll be watching you, Miss Whitlock, closely. Clara spent the next hours in a nightmare of familiar routines made strange by unfamiliar surroundings. The sick children reminded her achingly of Kai and the others back at the settlement. Same labored breathing, same dangerous fever, same desperate parents hovering nearby. The medicines she needed were right there on the shelf, tantalizingly close. Quinine bottles, fever powders, even some morphine-based preparations for pain. But they were carefully inventoried, and the doctor checked the supplies obsessively, making theft seem impossible. She needed a distraction, a crisis that would pull attention away from the medical supplies long enough for her to take what she needed. That night, Clara volunteered for the late watch over the sickest children, positioning herself as the dedicated angel of mercy who'd appeared from the desert to help. Mrs. Patterson approved this reluctantly, still suspicious but willing to accept free labor. Around midnight,
When the settlement had fallen into uneasy sleep and only a few guards remained on patrol, Clara made her move. She'd spent hours cataloging the medical supplies, memorizing which bottles contained what, planning exactly what she'd take and how she'd carry it. The only problem was the doctor, who'd insisted on sleeping in the medical room to monitor supplies. Clara waited until his breathing had deepened into the rhythms of sleep, then moved with aching slowness toward the supply shelf. Each step felt like it took hours. Each breath sounded impossibly loud in the quiet room. Her fingers had just closed around the first bottle when the doctor stirred. Clara froze, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might be visible through her clothing. The doctor muttered something in his sleep, rolled over, and settled back into deeper breathing. She filled her pockets with bottles, moving with the careful precision of someone defusing a bomb. Quinine, fever powders, a bottle of laudanum for the pain, another of some compound she didn't recognize but whose label suggested fever treatment. When her pockets could hold no more, Clara turned to leave and found herself face to face with Mrs. Patterson, holding a lantern and a very functional-looking pistol. "I knew you were lying," the woman said quietly. "Nobody survives 3 months alone in that desert without help. You've been with the savages, haven't you? That's where you learn to move so quietly, to hide what you're thinking behind those civilized manners." Clara's mind raced through possible responses and discarded them all as useless. "Yes," she said simply. "I've been with them. They saved my life when they could have killed me, and now their children are dying from the same fever killing yours. I came to get medicine because it was the only way to save them." "And you thought we'd just let you waltz in here and steal supplies to save savage children?" Mrs. Patterson's voice dripped contempt. "Where's your loyalty, girl? Where's your sense of who you are?" "I know exactly who I am," Clara said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "I'm someone who won't let children die when I can prevent it, regardless of what they look like or who their parents are. If that makes me a traitor, then I'm a traitor. But I'm taking these medicines and I'm leaving, and you can shoot me or let me go." Mrs. Patterson's finger tightened on the trigger, and Clara prepared for the bullet that would end this strange journey as violently as it had begun. But the shot didn't come. Instead, Mrs. Patterson lowered the pistol slightly, her face working through some internal struggle. "I lost a daughter to fever 2 years ago," she said finally. "Nothing we tried could save her. She was 7 years old and she died begging for water her body couldn't keep down. So I understand what you're trying to do, even if I think you're a fool for doing it." "Then let me go." "I can't. If I let you leave with those medicines, I'm as good as a traitor myself. The men here would—" She stopped, her eyes widening at something behind Clara. Clara turned to find the doctor awake and reaching for a rifle propped against the wall. Without thinking, she threw one of the bottles in her pocket at his head. It struck him in the temple with a solid crack, and he went down hard. "Run!" Mrs. Patterson hissed, lowering her pistol completely. "Run now before he wakes up and raises the alarm. Take the medicines. Save your children. But don't ever come back here. Understand? Next time I won't hesitate." Clara ran. She made it to her horse, mounted in a single desperate motion, and was galloping into the darkness before shouts began to rise behind her. Gunfire followed her into the desert night, wild shots that spoke more of panic than genuine aim, but none found their mark. She rode through the darkness with the same desperate focus that had carried her through every crisis since Boston, the stolen medicines pressing against her ribs like a promise. Behind her, the settlement erupted into full alarm. Ahead of her, somewhere in the vast desert darkness, children she'd come to love were burning with fever. The journey back took 3 days instead of 2, Clara pushing herself and the horse to the limits of endurance. She navigated by stars and landmarks remembered from her arrival, trusting the education Kale had given her about reading the desert's subtle signs. When the settlement's canyon finally came into view, Clara nearly sobbed with relief. She rode straight to the healing house, not bothering to dismount properly, just sliding off the horse and stumbling through the entrance with bottles clutched in both hands. "I got them," she gasped, her voice hoarse from days of breathing dust. "The medicines. I got them." Mira looked up from Kai's mat, her face showing the strain of 3 days without sleep. "You came back." "Of course I came back." Clara moved to Kai's side, already uncorking bottles and calculating dosages. "How many sick now?" 7 children, 2 adults. Kai's the worst. Mira's voice cracked slightly. Clara, if this doesn't work, it'll work. It has to work. Clara's hands were shaking as she measured out the quinine, mixing it with water to make it easier to swallow. Help me get him to drink this. The next hours blurred together in a haze of measured doses and careful monitoring.
Clara administered the medicines according to the best practices she remembered from Boston, adjusting for body weight and severity of symptoms. Mira worked beside her, translating instructions to worried parents, helping to force medicines down unwilling throats. Slowly, impossibly, the fevers began to break. Kai was the first, his temperature dropping just as dawn light began filtering into the healing house. His breathing steadied, deepened, became less of a desperate gasp and more of natural sleep. The little girl followed an hour later, then the youngest boy. By midday, all 7 children showed improvement. The adults followed soon after, their stronger constitutions responding faster to the treatment. Clara sat back against the wall, watching Kai's mother stroke her son's hair with trembling hands, and felt something break open in her chest. Relief, yes, but also something larger. Proof that her choice to return had been right. Proof that she belonged here in a way she'd never belonged anywhere. You saved them. Cale's voice came from the doorway, rough with emotion she'd never heard from him before. We saved them, Clara corrected. If you hadn't taught me to navigate the desert, if Mira hadn't kept them alive long enough for me to return, if the settlement had been an hour farther away. She shook her head. It took all of us. Cale crossed the room and pulled her to her feet, his hands gripping her shoulders hard enough to bruise. You came back. They said you wouldn't, said you'd use this as your chance to escape, but you came back. I promised you I would. Promises mean nothing when survival is at stake. People break them all the time. His eyes searched her face as if looking for answers to questions he hadn't yet formed. Why, Clara? You could have been free. You could have gone to California, started the new life you wanted. Why come back to a place where you'll always be an outsider? Because I'm not an outsider anymore, Clara said simply. Not really. I'm something else now. Something between your world and my old one, belonging fully to neither but choosing to make my home here anyway. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have. Clara leaned into his grip, feeling the solid reality of him anchoring her. Ask me again why I came back and I'll tell you about Kai calling me by name. Ask me about Sarah teaching me language and Mira trusting me with her children's lives. Ask me about sitting on that ridge and understanding for the first time what it means to be part of something larger than my own small survival. That's why I came back. Because home isn't a place you're born into. It's a place you choose, even when choosing it makes no logical sense. Kael's expression shifted, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw something that looked like vulnerability cross his features. If you died out there, if they'd caught you or killed you or convinced you to stay, I would have, but I didn't. I'm here. I'm alive. And those children are going to live because of medicines I stole from people who would have rather let them die. Clara reached up to touch his face, feeling the sharp bones beneath weathered skin. I made my choice, Kael. I chose this world. I chose your people. And if that means I can never go back, if that means I'm a traitor to my own kind, then so be it. Some betrayals are worth committing. He kissed her then, fierce and sudden and tasting like relief, and promises neither of them had dared to speak aloud. Clara kissed him back with 3 months of suppressed longing, with gratitude for being saved, and fury at everything that had tried to break her, and triumph at having survived it all. When they finally broke apart, Mira was watching from across the room with an expression that might have been approval. The council will want to hear about your journey, she said mildly, and about what you learned at the settlement. But that can wait until you've slept. Both of you look like you're about to fall over. Clara realized she was indeed swaying on her feet, exhaustion hitting her all at once now that the immediate crisis had passed. Kael steadied her, his arm around her waist, feeling like the most natural thing in the world. Come on, he said quietly. Let's get you somewhere you can rest. They walked through the settlement, and Clara noticed the way people watched them, not with the suspicion and hostility that had greeted her arrival, but with something else. Respect, maybe, or at least acknowledgement that she'd proven herself in the most fundamental way possible. In Kael's dwelling, Clara collapsed onto the sleeping mat and was asleep before she could form another coherent thought. When she woke hours later, the sun had set and Kael sat nearby, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read.
"What?" she asked, her voice still rough with sleep. "I'm trying to figure out when you stopped being a problem I needed to solve and became something else entirely." "And what's the conclusion?" "That I'm terrible at noticing when my life changes until I'm already standing in the middle of the transformation." He moved to sit beside her, his shoulder pressing against hers. "The settlement you went to, you said they're hunting us?" "They mentioned the army tracking your tribe. They're eager for information about locations, numbers, anything that might help them finish the job." Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him. "We bought time with those medicines, but it's not over. Eventually they'll come, and when they do, we'll be ready." Kael's voice carried absolute certainty. "We've survived worse. We'll survive this." Clara closed her eyes and tried to believe him, tried to imagine a future where the settlement's children grew up healthy and strong, where the army never found this hidden canyon, where she and Kael could build something lasting in this harsh, beautiful place. But in the darkness behind her closed eyes, she saw Mrs. Patterson's face and heard the woman's words, "Don't ever come back here." As if Clara had severed something fundamental by choosing medicine over loyalty, by choosing life over tribal allegiance. She'd saved the children. She'd proven herself. She'd made this place her home. But the cost of those victories was only beginning to reveal itself. The warning came 6 weeks later, delivered by a scout named Wren, who arrived at the settlement with his horse half dead from a ride that should have taken 2 days, but had clearly been compressed into one brutal push. Clara was teaching when the commotion started, working with Kai and 5 other children on multiplication tables using stones arranged in patterns on the ground. The sudden silence that fell over the settlement made her look up, and what she saw in the faces of the adults gathering near the canyon entrance made her blood run cold. "Stay here," she told the children, already moving toward the crowd despite knowing that whatever news had arrived, it wouldn't be anything she wanted to hear. Kael was there, listening to Wren's rapid report, with an expression that had gone dangerously blank. The same emptiness she'd seen on his face the night of the raid, when violence had been inevitable, and all that remained was calculating the most efficient path through it. "What's happening?" Clara asked, pushing through the crowd to reach his side. Wren glanced at her, then back to Kael, clearly uncertain whether to continue with her present. Kael made a sharp gesture that Clara had learned meant proceed. "Army patrol," Wren said, his English heavily accented but clear enough. 50 soldiers, maybe more. They have scouts, trackers who know the land. They're moving in a search pattern, checking every canyon, every water source. They're looking for us specifically." "How far?" Kael's voice was utterly calm, which somehow made the question more terrifying. 3 days at their pace, 2 if they push hard. Wren paused, his eyes flickering to Clara again. "They have someone with them, a woman from the settlement who claims to know where we are. She's guiding them." The bottom dropped out of Clara's stomach. Mrs. Patterson. It had to be. The woman had let her go but hadn't stayed silent about it, had probably been interrogated after the theft was discovered, had cracked under pressure or threats, or simply decided that her moment of compassion had been a mistake she needed to correct. "This is because of me," Clara said, the words tasting like ash. "They followed my trail, or Mrs. Patterson told them, or—" "It doesn't matter how they found us," Mira interrupted, her voice sharp. "What matters is they're coming, and we need to decide what to do about it." Chief Navin pushed through the crowd, his ancient face grave but composed. He spoke in the tribe's language, rapid sentences that Clara's still imperfect understanding could only partially follow. But she caught enough. Evacuation, defense, choices that all led to blood or displacement or both. "We can fight," Kael said, switching to English for Clara's benefit, or perhaps because he wanted her to understand the full scope of what was being discussed. "We know this canyon better than any outsider could. We can set traps, create ambush points, make them pay in blood for every step they take toward our home." "And how many of our people die in that fight?" Mira demanded. "How many children become orphans? How many mothers bury sons? How many die if we run?" Kael shot back. "How many starve when we leave behind our food stores, our water sources, our homes? Winter is coming. If we evacuate now, we're condemning ourselves to death by exposure instead of death by bullet. At least fighting gives us some control over our fate." The argument escalated, voices rising as different factions within the settlement advocated for different approaches.
Some wanted to fight, willing to die defending their home. Others insisted evacuation was the only rational choice, that living people could rebuild elsewhere, but dead martyrs served no one. Still others suggested negotiation, sending representatives to meet the army and try to broker some kind of peace. Clara listened to it all with growing horror, understanding that every option led to destruction of some kind. There was no winning here, no clever solution that would save everyone and preserve everything. There was only choosing which terrible outcome to embrace. There might be another way, she heard herself say, and was shocked when the arguing stopped and everyone turned to look at her. What if I go to them? I'm what they want, or at least I'm the excuse they're using to justify this hunt. If I surrender myself, tell them I escaped from captivity and got lost again, maybe they'd believe the settlement is abandoned or that you've moved on. Maybe they'd stop hunting you. The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. Then Kael laughed, a harsh sound without humor. No. It's the logical solution. I'm the connection between your world and theirs. I'm the proof that you exist and where you're located. Remove me from the equation and no. Kael moved toward her with that predatory grace she'd first witnessed during the raid, and for a moment Clara saw the warrior who'd killed without hesitation rather than the man who'd held her while she slept. You're not sacrificing yourself to soldiers who will interrogate you until you break and tell them everything anyway. You're not walking into certain torture and death because you've decided you're expendable. And you're absolutely not leaving this settlement.
It's not your decision to make. The hell it isn't. You're under my protection, which means I get a say in whether you throw your life away on a gesture that won't even accomplish what you think it will. Stop it, Chief Navin said quietly, but with enough authority that both Clara and Kael fell silent immediately. This is not a decision any individual makes. This is a choice for the council and for the people. We will hear all options, consider all consequences, and decide together.
He looked at Clara with those ancient knowing eyes. Including the option Clara has offered, however much we might wish there were better alternatives. The council meeting that followed was the longest of Clara's life. Every member of the settlement gathered in the circular space, and for hours they debated in a mixture of their own language and English, ensuring Clara understood every word of the discussion about her potential sacrifice. Sura spoke passionately against letting Clara go, arguing that she'd become too valuable as a teacher and bridge between worlds to waste on a futile gesture. Kai's mother surprised Clara by supporting the evacuation option, saying that no life, not Clara's, not the warriors who would die in battle, was worth losing their home over. Other voices rose and fell, each carrying the weight of genuine belief and desperate fear. When Taran stood to speak, Clara felt Kael tense beside her. The young man who'd served as translator during Clara's trial had been quiet for months, but now he addressed the council with surprising eloquence. We've been running for generations, Taran said, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. Our grandparents ran from the first settlers. Our parents ran from the gold seekers and the railroad builders. We've been running so long that we've forgotten what it means to stand and fight for something that matters. But this place matters. These springs, these walls, this canyon that has sheltered us. It matters. And maybe more importantly, we matter. Our right to exist, to have a home, to raise our children in peace, that matters too. He paused, his eyes finding Clara in the crowd. Clara asked why Kael brought her here instead of leaving her to die. I think I finally understand. He saw someone who'd been pushed out of her own world, someone whose people had decided she didn't fit their plans anymore. He recognized that because we've all felt it. We're all the people the expanding frontier has decided don't fit. But instead of accepting that judgment, instead of quietly dying or running forever, Clara chose to belong somewhere new. She chose us. His voice strengthened. Now we have to choose too. Do we keep running, or do we finally stand for something? The murmur that followed Taran's speech was complex, carrying layers of agreement and concern and desperate hope. Clara felt tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. She'd learned that showing too much emotion here was seen as weakness, and right now she needed to be strong. Chief Navin raised his hand for silence. We will vote. 3 choices stand before us. We fight and defend our home. We evacuate and seek safety elsewhere, or we send Clara to the soldiers and hope it satisfies their need for conquest. Every adult will cast a voice. The majority decides our path. The voting process was simple and brutal in its clarity. Each person stood and spoke their choice aloud, their voice carrying the weight of their conviction. Clara listened to her fate being decided by people she'd come to love, people she'd taught and learned from, people who had every reason to choose the option that removed her from their lives and their problems. When the final count was tallied, the result was devastating in its implications. Fight, 23 voices. Evacuate, 18 voices. Send Clara, 2 voices. We fight, Chief Navin announced, his ancient face showing no emotion. We prepare our defenses, we set our traps, and we fight for our home. May our choices honor our ancestors and protect our children. The gathering dispersed with grim purpose, people moving to tasks with the efficiency of those who'd prepared for violence before. Clara stood frozen in the center of the emptying circle, trying to process that they'd chosen to risk everything rather than sacrifice her. You look surprised, Mira said, appearing at her elbow. Did you really think we'd throw you to the soldiers after everything? I thought it was the logical choice, the smart choice. Logic isn't the same as wisdom, and smart isn't always right. Mira touched Clara's shoulder briefly, the gesture more comforting than any words could have been. You're one of us now. That means we protect you the same way you risked everything to protect our children. It's not complicated, Clara. It's just what family does. The word family hit Clara like a physical blow. She'd lost that concept so long ago, first when her husband died, then when Boston society turned its back on her, finally when she'd left everything familiar behind for a desert that should have killed her. But here, in this hidden canyon, with people who shared neither her language nor her history nor her skin, she'd found it again. I need to help prepare, Clara said, her voice thick with emotion she could no longer contain. Tell me what to do, how to be useful. Come with me. We're organizing supplies, planning evacuation routes in case the defense fails. Your organizational skills will be valuable. Mira started walking, then paused. And Clara, thank you for being willing to sacrifice yourself. Even though we're not taking that option, the fact that you offered matters to people. Remember that. The next 2 days passed in a blur of desperate preparation. Warriors sharpened weapons and scouted defensive positions. Women and elders organized supplies into portable bundles, identifying what could be carried if evacuation became necessary. Children were taught emergency protocols, where to hide, how to stay silent, when to run. Clara worked alongside everyone else, her hands busy with tasks while her mind churned through scenarios that all ended in blood and fire. She helped Sarah pack medical supplies, worked with Mira to create detailed maps of evacuation routes, and spent her nights lying awake in Kael's dwelling while he disappeared into the darkness to set traps and plan ambushes. On the second night, he returned just before dawn, his face grim. They're close, he said without preamble. I saw their campfires. They'll be here by tomorrow afternoon, maybe evening if we're lucky. Clara sat up, her heart hammering. How many? More than Wren said. 70, maybe 80 soldiers. They have artillery, small cannons they can set up quickly. This isn't a patrol, Clara. This is an extermination force. He sat down beside her, and in the pre-dawn light she could see exhaustion etched into every line of his face. We can't win this. Not a straight fight. We might take some of them down, might make them pay dearly, but the math doesn't work in our favor. Then we evacuate. Now, before they arrive. Already suggested that to Navin. He's considering it, but many of the warriors refuse to leave without fighting. They say if we run now, we'll be running forever. That sooner or later, we have to make a stand or accept that we have no right to exist anywhere. That's pride talking, not strategy. Maybe. But pride is all we have left sometimes. Pride and the refusal to quietly disappear because someone else decided we're inconvenient. Kael took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers with a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone so capable of violence. Clara, if things go badly tomorrow, don't say goodbye like this is already decided. I'm not saying goodbye. I'm saying that if we get separated, if chaos breaks out and we can't find each other, I need you to promise me something. What? That you'll survive. No matter what happens to me or the others, no matter how guilty you feel or how much you want to stay and fight, you survive. You take the children who can travel and you get them out. You teach them everything you know and make sure they grow up remembering that we existed, that we mattered, that we didn't go quietly. His eyes held hers with desperate intensity. Promise me. I can't promise to leave you. You can and you will, because that's the only way any of this means anything. We're not fighting so we can all die together in this canyon. We're fighting so that some of us survive, so that our story continues, so that the children we saved from fever get to grow up and have children of their own. His hand tightened on hers almost painfully. Promise me, Clara. I promise, she whispered, hating the words even as she spoke them. But you promise me something too. You promise that you'll try to survive, that you won't throw your life away on some grand gesture or last stand, that you'll be smart and careful and find a way back to me. I promised to try. It wasn't enough, but it was all she would get. They held each other as dawn broke over the canyon, both knowing that the world was about to crack open and spill violence across everything they'd tried to build. The army arrived just after midday, their approach announced by scouts who raced back to the settlement with reports that sent everyone into final preparations. Clara helped get the youngest children into the deep caves where they'd be hardest to find, her heart breaking at their frightened faces and whispered questions about whether they'd see their parents again. Stay quiet, she told them, using the tribe's language that had become almost as natural to her as English. Stay hidden. No matter what you hear, don't come out until Mira or Kael or someone you trust comes to get you. Understand? They nodded, solemn and terrified, and Clara wanted to scream at the injustice of children having to learn this kind of fear. From her position near the canyon entrance, Clara watched the army take up positions on the ridge above. They moved with professional efficiency, setting up their small cannons and organizing into formation with the ease of men who'd done this many times before. At their head rode an officer whose uniform marked him as someone of significant rank, and beside him, Clara's stomach turned. Mrs. Patterson sat on a horse, pointing toward the canyon, her face set in grim determination. The woman who'd let Clara escape had apparently decided that moment of mercy required correction. Or perhaps she'd never had a choice, had been threatened or coerced into revealing the settlement's location. It didn't matter now. She was here, and behind her came enough firepower to obliterate everything Clara had come to love. A voice boomed across the canyon, amplified by the natural acoustics of the rock walls. This is Captain Hendricks of the United States Army. We know you're harboring a white woman taken during a raid 6 months ago. Surrender her immediately and disperse peacefully, or face the full consequences of resisting federal authority. Clara moved a step forward, to offer herself and end this before it began, but Kael's hand closed around her wrist like an iron band. Don't, he hissed. They're not here to negotiate. Look at their formation, their weapons. They came to destroy us regardless of what we do. Giving yourself up won't change that. Chief Navin stepped forward instead, his aged body somehow radiating authority despite his physical frailty. He spoke in his own language first, words that Clara understood as a declaration of their right to exist, their claim to this land, their refusal to be erased. Then, in heavily accented English, "This is our home. We have taken nothing that was not freely given. We have harmed no one who did not attack us first. Leave us in peace, and we will trouble you no more." Captain Hendricks' laugh carried cruel amusement. Peace? You murdered settlers, stole supplies, and kidnapped a white woman. Your very existence is an act of aggression against civilized people trying to build a future in this territory. This is your final warning. Surrender now, or be removed by force. Then you'll have to remove us, Navin replied, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. We will not surrender our home. For a moment, Clara thought perhaps the captain would hesitate, would recognize the futility of slaughtering people defending their last refuge. Then she saw him raise his hand, saw the gesture that would unleash hell, and time seemed to slow down to individual heartbeats. Clara, run! Kael shoved her backward just as the first cannon fired. The explosion was deafening, the impact sending rock and dust cascading down the canyon wall. Clara scrambled backward, her ears ringing, her vision blurred by debris. Around her, the settlement erupted into controlled chaos, warriors taking up defensive positions, women and elders rushing toward the evacuation routes, children's voices crying out from the caves despite orders to stay silent. More cannon fire. More explosions that sent shockwaves through the stone beneath Clara's feet. She saw Taryn fall, blood blooming across his shoulder, and watched Sarah drag him toward cover with strength that seemed impossible from her small frame. Rifles cracked from both sides now, a deadly exchange that filled the air with smoke and the smell of gunpowder. Clara pressed herself against the canyon wall, feeling utterly useless, unable to fight or heal or do anything except witness the destruction of everything she'd chosen. Then she saw Mrs. Patterson. The woman had dismounted, was standing at the canyon's edge with an expression of horror as she watched the massacre unfold below. Their eyes met across the distance, and Clara saw recognition flash across the older woman's face, followed by something that looked like profound regret. Mrs. Patterson turned to Captain Hendricks, gesturing wildly, clearly arguing with him. The captain ignored her, focused entirely on the systematic destruction of the settlement. When Mrs. Patterson grabbed his arm, trying to force his attention, he backhanded her casually, sending her sprawling in the dust. Something inside Clara snapped. She didn't think, didn't plan, just moved. She ran toward the chaos instead of away from it, scrambling up the canyon wall using handholds she'd learned during months of living here. Bullets kicked up dirt near her feet, but she kept climbing, driven by fury that had been building since Boston, since her husband's death, since every moment of being powerless in the face of injustice.
"Clara, what are you doing?" Kael's voice, distant and desperate, but she couldn't stop to explain because she wasn't sure she understood it herself. She reached the ridge, emerged behind the army's line, and ran toward Captain Hendricks with all the speed her battered body could manage. A soldier tried to intercept her, but she ducked under his grasp, her smaller size and desperation making her faster than his armored bulk. "Stop!" she screamed, her voice somehow cutting through the chaos. "Stop this now!" Captain Hendricks turned, his face registering surprise that quickly shifted to cold assessment. "Miss Whitlock, I presume. You've caused quite a bit of trouble, but don't worry, we're here to rescue you from these savages." "I don't need rescuing, you idiot. I'm here by choice. These people saved my life, and I'm saving theirs." Clara positioned herself between the captain and his next volley of cannon fire, her body a fragile barrier that should have been meaningless but somehow made him pause. "Step aside, ma'am. That's an order." "I'm not one of your soldiers. You can't order me anywhere." Clara's voice shook but held firm. "And if you fire those cannons again, you'll have to go through me to do it." For a long moment, Captain Hendricks stared at her with an expression caught between disbelief and calculation. Then he smiled, and it was the cruelest thing Clara had ever seen. "So be it," he said, and raised his hand to signal the next volley. The shot came from below, a single rifle crack that echoed differently than all the others. The captain jerked backward, a red bloom spreading across his chest, and collapsed with a look of profound surprise frozen on his face. Clara spun to see Kael standing at the canyon's edge, rifle still smoking, his face set in the same deadly calm he'd worn during the wagon raid. Around him, the settlement's best warriors had taken up positions, their weapons trained on the now leaderless army. "The next man who moves dies," Kael called out in perfect English, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "Drop your weapons and back away slowly, or we start killing officers until there's no one left to give orders." The soldiers hesitated, looking to each other for guidance that wasn't coming. In the confusion, Clara saw her chance. She grabbed the nearest cannon, putting her full weight against it, and shoved it toward the canyon's edge. It was heavier than she'd anticipated, but momentum carried it over, sending it tumbling down to crash against the rocks below. "Help me!" she shouted at Mrs. Patterson, who'd climbed to her feet and stood frozen in shock. "Help me destroy these before more people die." For a heartbeat, Clara thought the woman would refuse. Then Mrs. Patterson moved, joining her in shoving the next cannon toward the edge. A soldier tried to stop them, but Kael's rifle cracked again, and the man went down clutching his leg. "I said don't move," Kael repeated, his voice carrying that edge of controlled violence that made Clara's skin prickle even now. Together, Clara and Mrs. Patterson destroyed 3 of the 4 cannons, sending them tumbling into the canyon to become useless scrap metal. The soldiers, leaderless and outmaneuvered, began to retreat, dragging their wounded with them, and leaving their dead where they'd fallen. It was over in minutes, though it felt like hours. One moment there was chaos and violence and the certainty of mutual destruction, and the next there was only silence broken by moans from the wounded and the sound of departing horses. Clara stood on the ridge, her hands bleeding from the rough metal of the cannons, her body shaking with delayed shock, and watched the army disappear into the desert. Beside her, Mrs. Patterson had sunk to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," the woman whispered. "I'm so sorry. They threatened my family, said they'd arrest my husband for harboring fugitives if I didn't tell them where you were. I thought if I cooperated, maybe they'd just take you and leave the rest alone. I didn't think they'd—" "I know," Clara said quietly. "I know you didn't." Below in the canyon, people were emerging from cover, taking stock of damage and losses. Clara could see bodies, too many bodies, lying still among the debris. She couldn't tell from this distance who had fallen, couldn't process the scope of what they'd lost. Then Cale was there, climbing the ridge with that same impossible speed, his hands reaching for her with desperate urgency. "Are you hurt? Did they—" "I'm fine. I'm okay." Clara let him pull her close, felt his heart hammering against her cheek. "Is it really over?" "For now. They'll regroup, probably come back with more soldiers, better weapons. We bought time, not safety." He pulled back to look at her face, his hands framing her cheeks. "What you did was insane and brave and incredibly stupid. Don't ever do it again." "I promised I'd survive. I didn't promise I'd do it safely." Despite everything, he laughed, a short, shocked sound. Then he kissed her hard, tasting like dust and gunpowder in desperate relief. And Clara kissed him back with the fierce joy of still being alive when death had seemed inevitable. When they finally broke apart, Mira was standing at the canyon's edge, looking up at them with an expression Clara couldn't quite read. "7 dead," she called up, her voice carrying the weight of each loss. 15 wounded, 3 of those seriously. The eastern water channel is destroyed and half our food storage collapsed in the bombardment. But we're alive. We held." She paused. "Clara, Cale, you need to get down here. Chief Navin wants to speak with both of you." The descent was harder than the climb, Clara's legs shaking so badly she had to lean on Kyle for support. At the bottom, the full scope of the destruction became clear. Buildings damaged, supplies scattered, blood staining the earth in places where people she'd known had fallen defending their home. Chief Navin sat near the council circle, a gash across his forehead being tended by one of the healers. Despite his injury, his eyes were sharp when Clara and Kyle approached. "You saved us," he said simply, speaking in his own language that Clara now understood well enough. "Both of you, the warrior who struck down their leader and the teacher who destroyed their weapons. You gave us the chance we needed to survive." He switched to English, his accent thick but his meaning clear. "But you also showed them we're willing to kill to defend ourselves. They will come back, and next time they will bring overwhelming force. We cannot stay here." "Then we evacuate," Kyle said, though Clara heard the pain in his voice. "We take what we can carry, and we find somewhere new, somewhere they won't find us." "Where?" Mira asked, stepping forward. "Where do we go that the army won't eventually follow? How many times can we run before we run out of places to hide?" The question hung unanswered in the air, heavy with implications none of them wanted to face. Clara looked around the damaged settlement, at the people tending wounded and gathering supplies and trying to salvage something from the wreckage of their home. Then she looked at Kyle, at the man who'd saved her life and changed everything she thought she knew about the world, and made a choice that felt both inevitable and terrifying. "We go north," she said quietly. "Deep into territory the army hasn't claimed yet. We find somewhere so remote, so difficult to reach, that even if they know we exist, they can't justify the resources to hunt us. And we build again. Better this time. Stronger." "You say we," Navin observed, "as if your fate is tied to ours now." "It is. I chose this when I came back with the medicine. I chose it again when I threw myself between you and those cannons. I'm choosing it now." Clara straightened her shoulders, meeting the chief's ancient gaze directly. "I'm one of you. For better or worse, my life is bound to this community. Where you go, I go. What you build, I help build. I'm done running from who I've become." Kyle's hand found hers, his fingers lacing through hers with a certainty that felt like a promise stronger than words. "Then we go north," Chief Navin said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute decision. "We leave at first light, taking only what we can carry. We mourn our dead and we honor their sacrifice by surviving, by continuing, by refusing to disappear."
He looked at Clara with something that might have been respect or might have been the acknowledgement of shared fate. You have earned your place here, Clara Whitlock. Not as an outsider, not as a guest, but as one of us. May you prove worthy of the blood that was spilled to keep you safe. That night, as the settlement prepared for departure and mourned those who would never make the journey, Clara stood beside Kyle and looked out over the canyon that had been her home for 6 transformative months. I thought I'd feel sad, she admitted quietly, leaving this place. But mostly I just feel determined, like this is one more thing that tried to break us and failed. They'll keep trying, Kyle warned. The army, the settlers, everyone who thinks this land belongs to them and them alone. It's not over, Clara. In some ways, it's just beginning. I know, but we're still here, still standing, still fighting for the right to exist. She leaned against him, drawing strength from his solid presence. That has to count for something. It counts for everything. He wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. We're going to survive this. All of it. And someday, when this frontier has moved on and the violence has faded, we'll build something that lasts. Something worth all this pain. Clara chose to believe him, chose to trust in the future they'd fight for together, chose to stand with these people who'd accepted her when her own world had cast her out. The desert had tested her and she'd survived. The fever had threatened them and she'd saved them. The army had tried to destroy them and they'd endured. Whatever came next, she would face it here, with these people, in this impossible life she'd chosen over every reasonable alternative. She was no longer Clara Whitlock of Boston, widow and exile, and lost soul-seeking California's promise. She was something new, something forged in violence and survival, and the fierce determination to belong somewhere that mattered. She was home. The exodus began before dawn, a silent procession of people carrying everything they owned on their backs or in hastily constructed travois, dragged behind horses too valuable to leave behind. Clara walked near the middle of the line, helping Sarah manage 3 of the youngest children whose parents had fallen in the battle. The children clung to her with a trust that both humbled and terrified her, their small hands gripping her skirt as they navigated the treacherous path out of the canyon. Behind them, smoke rose from the settlement. They'd burned what they couldn't carry. Better to destroy it than leave supplies for the army to claim or use as evidence of their existence. Clara didn't look back. She'd learned that survival meant focusing forward, always forward, even when your heart wanted to memorize everything you were losing. The journey north was brutal in ways that made her original trek west seem almost gentle by comparison. They moved through terrain so hostile that even experienced scouts sometimes lost the trail, across expanses of rock and sand that offered no water, no shelter, no mercy for those who couldn't maintain the punishing pace. 2 of the elderly died in the first week, their bodies left in shallow graves marked only by stones that would be indistinguishable from the desert floor within a season. Clara's feet, barely healed from her first desert crossing, opened up again into raw wounds that made each step agony. But she kept walking, kept helping with the children, kept teaching them words and songs during rest periods to distract them from hunger and fear and the growing certainty that they might all die out here in this endless wasteland. How much farther? She asked Kyle one night, 3 weeks into the migration. They'd stopped in a depression between 2 ridges that offered minimal protection from the wind that had started cutting across the desert as autumn deepened toward winter. Another week, maybe 2. There's a valley Naveen remembers from his youth before the treaties pushed us south. It's remote, difficult to reach, with natural defenses that make it nearly impossible to attack. If we can get there, we might finally be safe. And if we can't? Kyle didn't answer, which was answer enough. They both knew the mathematics of survival were working against them. Food was running dangerously low. Water sources were becoming harder to find. The children were weakening, and even the strongest warriors were showing signs of exhaustion that no amount of determination could overcome indefinitely. That night, as Clara lay beneath a blanket that offered inadequate warmth against the desert cold, she allowed herself to wonder if she'd made a terrible mistake. If choosing this life, this people, this impossible journey had been the romantic delusion of someone who'd never truly understood what survival demanded. Then Kai crawled over to her, his small body shivering, and pressed against her side for warmth. "Tell me about Boston,"
he whispered in the mixture of English and his own language that had become their shared communication. Tell me about the buildings that touch the sky and the ships that cross the ocean. So Clara told him stories, spinning tales of a world that seemed increasingly fictional even to her, and felt his breathing slow and deepen as sleep finally claimed him. She held him close, this child she'd saved and who'd saved her in return by giving her purpose, and renewed her determination to see him safely to whatever future they could build. The valley, when they finally reached it 34 days after leaving the canyon, was everything Naven had promised, and more. Tucked between mountains that rose like walls against the sky, accessible only through narrow passes easily defended or hidden, it held springs that fed a small river and land that could support crops if they could survive long enough to plant them. "This is it," Naven announced, his voice carrying despite its frailty. "This is where we rebuild, where we make our stand not through violence but through the simple refusal to disappear." The first winter nearly killed them anyway. They had no proper shelters, insufficient food stores, and the mountain cold was merciless in ways desert heat had never been. Clara worked alongside everyone else, building structures from whatever materials they could find, hunting and gathering with skills she'd never imagined needing, teaching the children in makeshift schools because education was the one thing they could control when so much else remained beyond their power. She and Cale were married that winter, in a ceremony that blended traditions from both their worlds and created something entirely new. Mira officiated, speaking words about two people who'd chosen each other across impossible divides, who'd survived things that should have destroyed them, who represented the possibility of building bridges where others saw only chasms. "Do you take this man," Mira asked in English, "knowing that the life he offers is hard and uncertain, that you may face hunger and danger and losses that break your heart, but also knowing that he will stand beside you through all of it?" "I do," Clara said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "And do you take this woman," Mira continued, switching to her own language so Kael would respond in kind, "knowing that she carries two worlds inside her and will sometimes struggle with the weight of both, but also knowing that she has proven herself worthy of our trust and your love?" "I do," Kael replied, his hand gripping Clara's with a strength that promised everything words could not. They spent their wedding night in a shelter barely larger than a closet, huddled together for warmth while wind howled outside. It wasn't romantic by any conventional measure, but when Kael held her and whispered that she was the bravest person he'd ever known, Clara felt richer than she'd ever been in Boston's finest drawing rooms. Spring came slowly to the mountain valley, but it came. With it arrived the possibility of planting, of building permanent structures, of creating something that might last. Clara threw herself into the work with everyone else, her hands blistering and bleeding as she helped construct homes and irrigation channels and the foundations of a community that refused to be erased. Sarah became her closest friend and fiercest ally, the two of them working together to establish a school that taught children both worlds, mathematics and science, alongside traditional knowledge, English and Spanish for trading alongside their own language, the skills they'd need to navigate a changing frontier without losing themselves in the process. "You're creating something revolutionary," Sarah told her one afternoon as they watched their students tackle a particularly challenging geometry problem. "Teaching them that they can honor their heritage while also adapting to survive. That tradition and change aren't enemies." "I'm just teaching them what I learned," Clara replied. "That identity isn't fixed, that survival sometimes means becoming someone new, and that the strongest people are those who can hold multiple truths without breaking." Word of their settlement spread slowly through networks Clara didn't fully understand, traders and travelers who moved through the frontier carrying information alongside goods. Some of what they heard was encouraging. The army patrol that had attacked their canyon had been officially reprimanded for excessive violence, Captain Hendricks posthumously stripped of rank. The frontier was shifting, policies changing as voices in the East began questioning the human cost of westward expansion. Other news was less hopeful. New settlements were being established at an accelerating pace, each one pushing deeper into lands that had belonged to indigenous peoples for generations. The pressure was constant, relentless, and Clara understood that their mountain refuge was only temporary safety, not permanent solution. In their third spring in the valley, Clara realized she was pregnant,
The knowledge terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. This child would be born into uncertainty, would carry two worlds in their blood, would face challenges she couldn't fully anticipate or prevent. "We'll figure it out," Kyle said when she told him, his hand spreading across her still flat stomach with wonder. "We've survived everything else. We'll survive this too." Their daughter was born in late autumn, delivered by Mira with Sarah assisting, arriving into the world with a cry that sounded like defiance. They named her Nijoni, a word from Kyle's language meaning beautiful, and Clara thought she'd never heard anything more true. Holding her daughter for the first time, Clara felt the last threads connecting her to her old life finally snap. She wasn't running from Boston anymore, wasn't trying to escape grief or shame or society's judgment. She was simply here, in this mountain valley, with this man and this child and this community she'd fought and bled and nearly died to belong to. "She has your eyes," Kael observed, touching Nijoni's tiny hand with the same gentleness he'd shown Clara on the ridge years ago. "And my stubbornness, probably. We're going to have our hands full." "I wouldn't have it any other way." The years that followed were marked by slow, hard-won progress. The settlement grew as other displaced families found their way to the valley, drawn by rumors of a place where different peoples could coexist, where tradition and adaptation weren't treated as mutually exclusive. Not everyone stayed. Some found the isolation too much, the demands of the harsh land too great, but enough remained to build something real. Clara taught 3 generations of children, watching Kai grow into a young man who could navigate both worlds with the ease she'd worked so hard to achieve. Sarah married Taryn, who'd survived his shoulder wound to become one of the settlement's most skilled negotiators. Mira grew old gracefully, her fierce intelligence undiminished even as her body weakened, until the day she died peacefully in her sleep with Clara holding her hand. "You did well," Clara whispered to Mira's still form, thinking of the woman who'd threatened to kill her on arrival and who'd become the closest thing to a mother she'd known since childhood. "You built something that will outlast all of us." When Nijoni was 7, old enough to understand, Clara took her daughter to the ridge overlooking the valley and told her the full story. About Boston and the wagon raid and the medicine run and the battle that had forced them here. About choices made and prices paid and the long, difficult journey from being an outsider to becoming integral. "Why are you telling me this?" Nijoni asked, her young face serious. "Everyone already knows the stories. They're practically legends. Because legends smooth away the complicated parts, and I need you to understand the truth. I need you to know that I'm not a hero from some story. I'm just a person who kept choosing to move forward even when I didn't know if it was the right choice, who survived through stubbornness and luck and the kindness of people who had every reason to let me die." Clara pulled her daughter close. "And I need you to know that you're not just one thing. You're not just your father's daughter or mine, not just Nijoni of this settlement or some white child's granddaughter. You're all of it, and that makes you stronger, not weaker." "But what if people try to make me choose? The traders say the towns are growing, that more people are coming west. What if someday I have to pick which world I belong to?" "Then you do what I did. You create your own world where those choices don't have to be made. You find people who accept all of you, and you build something with them that's stronger than any single culture or tradition." Clara touched her daughter's face gently. "The frontier is changing, little one, in ways we can't fully predict. But I truly believe it's changing toward something better. Toward a place where people like you, people who belong to multiple worlds, can help build bridges instead of walls." Years passed in the rhythm of mountain seasons. Harsh winters that tested their resolve. Brief, beautiful summers that reminded them why they fought to stay. Autumns of harvest and preparation. Springs of renewal and hope. Clara's hair began to gray, though Kael insisted it made her look distinguished rather than old. Her hands developed calluses in new places, her body shaped by years of physical labor into something far different from the soft Boston teacher who'd stepped off that train so long ago. When Nijoni was 16, traders brought news that made Clara's heart hammer with complex emotions. The territory had achieved statehood. Laws were being written, boundaries drawn, treaties negotiated. The wild frontier they'd known was being systematically transformed into something more organized, more civilized, more regulated. "Is this good news or bad?" Kael asked, reading the uncertainty in Clara's expression. Both, probably. It means more pressure on places like this, but it also means more protections under law. It means change we can't control, but also opportunities we couldn't access before. Clara studied the trader's papers, squinting at the small print. There's a clause here about land rights for established settlements. If we can prove we've been here continuously for 5 years, we might be able to claim legal ownership. Make this place officially ours under the new state's laws. Chief Navin, ancient now and increasingly frail, listened to this news with a skepticism earned through decades of broken promises. Legal ownership, he repeated slowly. Under whose authority? Using whose laws? We've been here for generations before there was a United States, and will be here long after. Why should we need their permission to exist? Because whether we like it or not, they're the ones with the power to enforce their rules, Clara said gently. We can ignore them and hope they ignore us, or we can use their own laws to protect ourselves. Neither option is perfect, but one seems more likely to keep our children safe. The debate continued for weeks, dividing the settlement between those who wanted no part of government recognition and those who saw it as practical necessity. In the end, they compromised. They would register the settlement and claim land rights, but on their own terms, with language that protected their autonomy and traditions. Clara helped draft the documents, using every bit of her education to craft legal language that sounded cooperative while preserving their independence. When she finally signed her name, Clara Whitlock Riven, using both her old name and the new one she'd adopted, it felt like closing one chapter and opening another. The government surveyors who eventually arrived were young men, fresh from Eastern universities, who approached the settlement with a mixture of curiosity and condescension. They clearly expected to find a primitive camp, and their surprise at discovering well-built structures, irrigated fields, and a functioning school was almost comical. "You're Clara Riven?" one of them asked, consulting his papers. "The woman who filed these claims?" "I am." "And you speak English fluently?" "It was my first language. I was born in Boston, educated there, taught school before coming west." Clara didn't mention the circumstances of that journey. Let them assume what they would. "Is there a problem with our filing?" "No, ma'am, it's just unusual. Most settlements out here are, well," he gestured vaguely, clearly struggling to articulate his assumptions without causing offense. "Most settlements aren't like this one," Clara finished for him. "We're aware, that's rather the point." The surveyors spent 3 days in the valley, measuring and documenting and filling out forms in triplicate. Clara watched them work and felt a strange sense of victory. They'd survived long enough to be officially recognized, to claim rights under the very system that had tried to destroy them. It wasn't justice. Nothing could undo the losses they'd suffered, the people they'd buried, the homes they'd been forced to abandon. But it was something. When Najoni turned 20, she announced her intention to travel to one of the new towns being established in the territory. "I need to see it," she explained to Clara and Kael over dinner. "The world that's coming, the places where people like me might fit. I can't spend my whole life in this valley, no matter how much I love it." Clara's first instinct was to forbid it, to keep her daughter safe within the mountains where she understood the dangers. But looking at Najoni's determined face, she saw her own younger self, the woman who'd boarded that train west despite not knowing what awaited her, who'd chosen uncertainty over suffocating safety. "Then go," Clara said, ignoring Kael's sharp look. "Go see the world and learn everything you can. But come back and tell us about it. Help us understand what's coming so we can prepare." Najoni left in the spring, traveling with traders who'd been coming to the valley for years and who promised to keep her safe. Clara stood at the valley entrance and watched her daughter disappear into the distance and felt her heart split between pride and terror. "She'll be fine," Kael said, his arm around Clara's shoulders. "She's your daughter, stubborn, brave, too smart for her own good. She'll survive whatever she finds out there." "I know. That doesn't make it easier to watch her go. You watched me go into battle knowing I might not return. You watched this entire settlement nearly destroy itself and somehow held it together. You can survive this too." Clara leaned into him, drawing strength from his presence. "When did you become the optimistic one? I'm supposed to be the one offering reassurance." "We take turns. That's how partnerships work." Najoni returned 3 months later with stories that both excited and troubled Clara.
The new towns were chaotic mixtures of people from everywhere. East Coast immigrants, former soldiers, displaced indigenous people, freed slaves seeking new starts, Chinese workers from the railroad. The old divisions hadn't disappeared, but they were being challenged by proximity and necessity. People who'd never have spoken to each other back east were finding ways to coexist, to trade, to occasionally even befriend each other. It's not perfect, Nijoni reported at a gathering of the entire settlement. There's still violence, still hatred, still people who think some humans are worth more than others. But there's also possibility. Space for people who don't fit neat categories.
I met 3 other people like me, children of mixed heritage who are creating their own identities instead of choosing between their parents' worlds. "And what did you learn about our safety here?" Chief Navin asked, his voice thin with age but his mind still sharp. "That we're too remote to bother with and not valuable enough to fight over. The government recognizes our land rights and doesn't care what we do here as long as we don't cause problems. We're tolerated."
Nijoni chose her words carefully. It's not acceptance, but it might be enough. Years continued their inexorable march. Clara taught until her hands grew too stiff with arthritis to write clearly, then taught verbally until her voice began to fail. Cale's hair turned silver, his movements slower but still graceful, still carrying that dangerous competence that had first captured Clara's attention. Chief Navin died peacefully in his sleep at an age no one could quite calculate, and the settlement mourned him with ceremonies that lasted 3 days. Clara spoke at his memorial, using both languages fluently now, talking about a man who'd chosen mercy when violence would have been easier, who'd led through wisdom rather than force, who'd kept them alive through sheer force of will and careful planning. "He gave us a gift," Clara said, looking out at faces she'd known for decades. "The gift of time. Time to build, to heal, to become something more than just survivors. We honor him by continuing that work, by ensuring that what we've built here outlasts all of us." Sarah took over as the settlement's primary leader, with Taryn handling external negotiations and trade. Kai, grown into a man of considerable presence, became the head of security, using the lessons Kael had taught him to train a new generation in defense that was more about strategy than violence. Clara found herself in the unexpected role of historian, recording the settlement's story in careful writing that filled dozens of ledgers. She documented everything: the raid, the migration, the battles and losses, and small victories that had brought them to this point. Future generations would need to understand where they came from, the prices paid for their relative peace. When Nijoni married a young man from one of the trading towns, someone whose heritage was as mixed as hers, Clara attended the wedding with joy that was only slightly tinged with melancholy. Her daughter had chosen to build a life that spanned both valley and town, refusing to be limited by geography or expectation. "You did good," Kael whispered during the ceremony, his hand finding Clara's with the same certainty it had for 30 years. "Look at what you built, what we built together." Clara looked around the settlement, at the permanent structures and cultivated fields, at the school building that had grown to accommodate 50 students, at the community center where different peoples gathered to share knowledge and traditions, at the children playing games that blended multiple cultures into something entirely new. "It's not what I imagined when I boarded that train in Boston," she admitted. "Is it better or worse?" "It's real. That's what matters. It's real and it's ours, and it exists because we refuse to accept the world as it was presented to us." She squeezed his hand. "I have no regrets." "Not even one?" "Not even one." More years passed, measured now in grandchildren and great-grandchildren, in students who became teachers themselves, in incremental improvements and occasional setbacks that felt less catastrophic because they'd survived so much worse. The frontier Clara had known continued its transformation into something more settled, though pockets of wilderness remained where people could still find refuge or reinvention. Traders brought news from the wider world, wars and peace treaties, technological innovations, social movements that challenged old assumptions about race and gender and who deserved rights. Clara listened to these reports with interest but not longing. The world beyond the mountains had its own trajectory, and while it occasionally intersected with theirs, they'd created something separate, something that didn't require validation from outside. When Clara was 73, a delegation arrived from one of the larger towns, official representatives from the territorial government investigating stories they'd heard about the valley settlement. We've received reports, their leader said carefully, of an unusual community here.
One that seems to have achieved something remarkable in terms of integration and cooperation. We'd like to understand how you've managed it, potentially use your model elsewhere. Clara, her hair now completely white and her body bent by decades of hard labor, smiled at the irony. You want to know our secret? It's not complicated. We stopped treating differences as problems to solve and started treating them as strengths to build on. We stopped asking people to abandon who they were and started creating space for multiple truths to coexist. She paused. Also, we were all running from something, which gave us common ground. Desperation makes people creative about finding solutions. But surely there have been conflicts, disagreements about culture or tradition or leadership? Of course. We're human. We argue and make mistakes and occasionally hurt each other. But we've also learned that survival requires cooperation, that rigid categories don't work when real people are more complicated than the boxes we try to put them in. Clara gestured to the settlement around them. Look at what's here. Really look. These aren't separated communities maintaining isolation. This is integration built through daily practice. Children learning multiple languages. Families sharing traditions. People making room for each other's humanity, even when it's uncomfortable. The delegates left with notebooks full of observations and promises to return, though Clara suspected they wouldn't truly understand what they'd seen. You couldn't replicate this place simply by copying its structures or policies. You needed the desperation, the necessity, the forced proximity that made cooperation the only rational choice. But perhaps, she thought, perhaps they'd take some kernel of truth back with them. Plant it somewhere it might grow into something useful. That night, lying beside Kyle in the home they'd built together, Clara reflected on the impossible journey that had brought her from Boston's suffocating propriety to this mountain valley where she'd finally learned to breathe. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd left me in that wagon circle? She asked quietly. Every day for the first year, less frequently after that. Now, almost never. Why? Because I was thinking about all the tiny choices that led here. If you'd made a different decision in that moment, if I'd refused your hand, if the fever had killed Kai before I got the medicine, if the army had caught us in the canyon. She turned to face him in the darkness. So many points where everything could have gone differently. But it didn't. We're here. We survived. We built something that will outlast us. Cale's hand found her face, his thumb tracing the lines that decades had carved there. Stop wondering about roads not taken. This road, the one we actually walked, led somewhere worth reaching. Clara fell asleep with those words warming her and dreamed of the girl she'd been, the widow fleeing Boston, certain that California held the answers to questions she barely understood. She wanted to tell that girl so many things, that the answers wouldn't be where she expected, that she'd find home in the last place she'd imagined looking, that the greatest adventures came from accepting invitations from dangerous strangers in the middle of chaos. But mostly she wanted to tell her younger self to trust the journey, trust the choices that felt insane, trust that sometimes the wildest path led to the most genuine destinations. In her 91st year, Clara finally set down her pen and declared the historical record complete. The ledgers filled an entire wall of the community center, a testament to decades of careful documentation. Sarah, now the settlement's eldest leader, organized a ceremony to honor the completion. You've given us our story, Sarah said, her own hair now silver, her face lined with the same weather patterns that marked Clara's. You've ensured that our children's children will know where we came from, what we survived, who we were before we became who we are. Thank you. Clara looked out at the gathered crowd, easily 300 people now, representing a mixture of heritages so complex that trying to categorize them was meaningless. They'd all become something new, something the old world's labels couldn't capture. The story isn't finished, Clara said, her voice still strong despite her age. I've just written the beginning. You're all living the continuation, and your children will write chapters I can't imagine. But remember where it started. With people who refused to accept the limits others tried to impose on them, who chose possibility over certainty, cooperation over division, survival over surrender. Keep choosing those things, and the story will continue long after all of us are dust. Cale died first, peacefully, in his sleep during the winter of Clara's 93rd year. She'd known it was coming, had seen him growing more tired, more ready to rest, but the absence still felt like losing a limb. They'd spent more than 60 years together, had survived things that should have killed them, had built a life that defied every reasonable expectation. "You kept your promise," she whispered to his still form, remembering the vow he'd made during the battle. "You tried to survive. You came back to me every time. Well done, my love. Well done." She buried him in the valley's cemetery, beside Navin and Mira and too many others whose names she carried like weights. Najoni returned with her children and grandchildren, and the funeral became a celebration of a life that had spanned 2 centuries of frontier transformation, that had witnessed the end of one world and the birth of another. Clara lasted another year without him, long enough to see her great-great-grandchildren take their first steps, long enough to finish one final addendum to the historical record. Then, on a spring morning when the valley was painted in wildflowers and new growth, she lay down for a nap and simply didn't wake up. They found her with a smile on her face and a letter clutched in her hand. Instructions she'd written for her funeral, insisting on no mourning, only celebration. "I gotta live 3 lifetimes in one," she'd written. "I gotta be a Boston teacher, a frontier refugee, and a mountain settler. I got to love and be loved, to save children and be saved by them, to witness the birth of something unprecedented. Do not grieve that it ended. Celebrate that it happened at all." The funeral drew people from across the territory. Traders who'd known her for decades, students she'd taught who'd gone on to become teachers themselves, government officials who'd learned about integration from studying her settlement, descendants who carried her legacy in their very existence. Najoni stood at her mother's grave and told the assembled crowd about the woman who'd refused to be defined by any single identity, who'd built bridges through sheer force of will and stubborn refusal to accept that differences had to equal divisions. "She used to tell me," Najoni said, her voice carrying across the cemetery, "that she wasn't brave, that she just kept making the next necessary choice without thinking too hard about the long-term consequences. But I think that's what real courage is. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. To keep choosing connection over isolation, possibility over despair, love over hate." She paused, looking down at the simple marker they'd placed. "My mother came west looking for California. She found something better. She found us. And in finding us, in choosing us, she showed all of us what it means to truly belong somewhere, not because you were born there, but because you fought for the right to exist there." Years turned to decades, and the settlement Clara had helped build continued to evolve. The valley became known throughout the territory as a place where integration actually worked, where people of different backgrounds created something greater than the sum of their parts. Scholars came to study it. Families came seeking refuge from discrimination elsewhere. Children grew up speaking 3 or 4 languages and thinking nothing of it, their identities too complex for the old categories that had once defined human worth. The ledgers Clara had filled became required reading in the settlement school, her story woven into the curriculum alongside mathematics and science and traditional knowledge. Each generation learned about the widow from Boston who'd accepted a warrior's hand in the darkness, who'd risked everything to save children not her own, who'd stood between cannons and her chosen people with nothing but conviction to protect her. The story became legend, and the legend became mythology, and the mythology became truth of a different kind, not just what happened, but what it meant. It became a story about choice and consequence, about the courage required to become someone new, about the revolutionary act of refusing to let others define the boundaries of your belonging. And on quiet nights, when the valley lay peaceful under mountain stars, when grandmothers told stories to children who took for granted the freedoms those stories had cost, you could almost imagine Clara there still, watching over the impossible things she'd helped create, smiling at how far they'd come from that desperate night when a warrior offered his hand and a terrified widow chose to trust him. The desert had tested her, the frontier had tried to break her, but in the end, Clara Whitlock Riven had done what seemed impossible. She'd survived not by hardening herself against the world, but by opening herself to it. She'd found home not by seeking somewhere that would accept her as she was, but by having the courage to become something new entirely. And in that transformation, in that willingness to evolve rather than retreat, she'd shown everyone who came after that the frontier's greatest promise wasn't land or gold or new beginnings. It was the freedom to decide for yourself who you would become, and the courage to make that decision mean something. That was the legacy she left behind. That was the story that endured. That was the truth that outlasted every hardship, every loss, every moment of doubt or despair. Some boundaries were meant to be crossed. Some worlds were meant to collide. Some people were meant to stand in the spaces between established categories and create entirely new ways of being human. Clara had been one of those people. And the valley she'd helped build stood as permanent proof that the bravest act in a changing world wasn't holding on to what you'd always been. It was having the courage to become something more.